July 2, 1943. Castelvetrano Aerodrome, Sicily. General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, a Luftwaffe veteran and defender of Nazi racial doctrine, would have laughed if he had known. On that day, a new American fighter unit had appeared on German radars. They were not experienced frontline pilots. They were black, trained separately, designated as an experiment, and seen as a curiosity. For the Germans, it was a tactical mistake and an ideological insult. After all, according to the Luftwaffe's own manual, blacks were biologically incapable of operating cutting-edge technology, let alone flying a fighter effectively. That conviction, however, was on the verge of collapsing. The pilots who debuted under the Mediterranean sky did not come from a white elite, but from the Tuskegee base in Alabama. They were the red tails, men trained under pressure, operating inferior machines, carrying the weight of discredit and the duty to prove, in flight, that their brains and hands were as lethal as any white man's. This video reconstructs the technical, logistical, and moral trajectory of the Tuskegee Airmen. As a segregated unit, it racked up more than 100 confirmed kills against the Luftwaffe elite. How arrogance turned into loss. How laughter became silence. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any sentence. 112 confirmed aerial victories, recorded by a unit that wasn't even considered combat-worthy by its own nation. While the Luftwaffe relied on the technical supremacy of its jets, 3 of them, the dreaded Mi-262s, were shot down in a single afternoon by pilots who had trained more hours than their white counterparts, but received less equipment, less recognition, and no guarantee of return. These men did not seek glory, they sought to prove a point. If you value accurately told history, in-depth research, and respect for facts, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This allows us to continue revealing what the war tried to hide and what prejudice tried to erase. In 1941, while Germany was already operating on multiple fronts and relying on overstretched rail logistics to sustain its war machine, the United States was still heating up engines. But when American industry got moving, the sound of each assembly line echoed like a sentence. The Civilian Pilot Training Program, created in 1939, had planted its seed in camps such as Tuskegee, Alabama. The official goal was modest: to train black pilots without compromising the racial hierarchy of the military. The real goal, however, would emerge from the statistics. In 4 years, the United States trained more than 193,000 military pilots, while Germany, suffocated by the blockade and Allied bombing, could barely replace its downed aces. While Berlin was betting on the genius of a few men and exotic machines like the Mi-262, America was betting on scale. For every fighter produced by the Reich, the United States delivered nearly 5, and even segregated units, such as the Red Tails, were fed by this industrial flow. The Tuskegee training ground, though isolated and underfunded, operated with almost obsessive rigor. There, a cadet flew an average of 300 hours before being considered ready. This was 50% more than the national average. The logic was cruel. Making mistakes was not an option for a black driver. The elimination rate during training reached 60%. Only the most disciplined, the coldest under pressure, crossed the sky. Meanwhile, Germany was facing a war of attrition, not just at the front but in the factories. Aluminum became scarce, fuel was rationed, and the maintenance of damaged fighters became a daily puzzle. In contrast, the Red Tails P-51 Mustangs, powered by the American assembly line and the British-engineered Merlin engine, were thrust into the skies at industrial speed. By 1944, the United States was producing 26,000 aircraft a year. Germany, less than 8,000. The difference wasn't just in the number, it was in the philosophy. The Luftwaffe invested in revolutionary prototypes. America invested in reliability, fast maintenance, and standardization. The war in the skies would be won by whoever stayed the longest flying, and the Red Tails flew more than anyone else. During training, they were deprived of new aircraft. Worn-out P-40s flew, rejected by other units. But even so, their successful mission rates rivaled the best formations in the 15th Air Force. In 1943, as Berlin tightened racial restrictions within the Wehrmacht, Tuskegee pilots crossed the Atlantic. They arrived with little prestige and no external expectation of success. But there was an unseen advantage. While many elite groups were still shaped by aristocratic culture and combat informality, the Tuskegee operated by protocol. Every takeoff, every patrol, every maneuver was the result of instruction and strict discipline. What for the Germans was instinct, for the Red Tails was calculation, and it was exactly this method that would prove unbeatable. A 1944 report from the U.S. War Department, ignored by many, pointed to a statistic that German pilots did not know when facing them. The loss rate of bombers protected by the Red Tails was 0.66% per mission. Other units of the same Air Force recorded rates above 1.5%. That is, when the red-tailed fighters were in the air, the B-17s returned home with twice the chance of survival. Now, here's a statistic that few knew at the time, and that the Luftwaffe never took seriously. American production of high-octane jet fuel in 1944 was 10 times greater than Germany's total capacity. 10 times. This difference allowed for longer flights, continuous refueling, and intensive training. The Tuskegee, even segregated, flew more and missed less. If this statistic surprised you, write in the comments. Logistics wins. Your opinion helps to give voice to the forgotten facts. On the field, the Germans continued to rely on the enemy's racial disorganization. The belief was clear: a black unit would not withstand a prolonged clash. But what the doctrine did not see, the radars would see, because the real fight had not yet begun. And when the Luftwaffe encountered the 99th for the first time on a real escort mission, no rehearsed maneuver would prepare its aces for what they would come to face. The 99th Fighter Squadron was not born as an elite unit, nor as a strategic response to a need for war. It was born as an experiment. In January 1941, when Secretary of War Henry Stimson announced its creation, he did so with one caveat: it will be a test to see if Negroes can be trained as combat pilots. The language was clear. It was not a matter of trusting, but of testing. The base of the experiment was set up in Tuskegee, Alabama, a city surrounded by plantations, legalized segregation, and social structures that still resembled the 19th century. The instructors were white, the commands were separate, and the entire logistical apparatus operated under the idea that, at any moment, everything could be canceled. In 1925, the War College of the United States had published a report entitled The Employment of Black Labor in the War. The document, adopted as an unofficial doctrine until the 1940s, stated that blacks were mentally inferior, undisciplined, emotionally unstable, and incapable of technical leadership. This ideological basis sustained military segregationism and fueled the silent expectation that the 99th would fail, preferably without having to be canceled by decree. It would be enough to let them fail. In Germany, the doctrine was even more explicit. Untermensch's concept classified blacks as subhuman. The Luftwaffe, though more technical than ideological in its ranks, absorbed this racial view by considering that no real air force would be composed of blacks. It was unthinkable that someone trained in a separate system, with second-line planes and reduced support, would pose a risk to pilots trained under German cutting-edge engineering. The Luftwaffe manuals did not even consider the possibility of finding a black unit. But, ironically, it was precisely this contempt that allowed the 99th to go unnoticed in the first weeks of combat. Their operating records began to accumulate without fanfare. No one expected results. The selection to join the 99th was brutal. The national average of elimination of cadets in aviation was 40%. In Tuskegee, this rate was as high as 60%. Many of those who failed never flew again. Those who survived the Civ were shaped not just by technical knowledge, but by a kind of quiet discipline that was born out of the fear of making mistakes and being erased. The squadron's first commander, Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., knew exactly what it meant to operate under scrutiny. A graduate of West Point, he spent 4 years in training without any white classmates speaking to him outside of formal obligations. Social silence as a method of exclusion. Now he commanded men who had something in common. They were all on trial. The white instructors watched each takeoff as if they were expecting an accident, and many commanders of the Air Force itself were waiting for the ideal moment to declare the experiment a failure. But he did not fail. On the contrary, the 99th began operating with a lower incident rate than the average of other training squadrons. The pilots stood out, not for their aggressiveness, but for their precision. That bothered me. In 1943, upon being assigned to the 33rd Fighter Group in North Africa, the 99th was met by a skeptical commander, Colonel William Momyer. His solution was simple: relegate the Tuskegee to low-priority patrols, away from the main actions. For weeks, the 99th's common-tailed planes crisscrossed the Mediterranean sky on secondary missions, while decisive battles took place in other regions. Momyer hoped the squad would disappear through irrelevance, but they began to deliver results. Each flight, even limited, was used with maximum efficiency, and then came the first real combat, an attack on the Italian island of Pantelleria in June 1943. The mission involved protecting B-25 bombers from possible interception. The pilots of the 99th maintained formation, protected the targets, and returned without losses. No aircraft crashed. The reports have been delivered. The results were ignored. Still, the penny was beginning to drop among those who flew alongside them. The bombers noticed that the red tails, still without the name but already with discipline, held position even under fire. They did not seek glory, persecutions, or acrobatics. They escorted them. They came back. And more importantly, they made the bombers come back. The technical culture of the 99th reflected a silent decision. They could not make mistakes. They did not have the right to improvise. The mistake of a black pilot was everyone's mistake. And this generated a ruthless operational logic. Either they flew as a unified machine, or they would be dismantled one by one. This mentality, born of the prejudice that surrounded them, would eventually become their greatest tactical advantage. Unlike traditional units where experienced pilots shaped doctrines based on their individual instincts, the Tuskegee followed protocols. They were not solitary aces. They were gears. Each pilot was trained to protect the other. Each formation was planned down to the last detail, and this standardization, ironically rejected by racist doctrine, would end up creating one of the most effective escort forces in the war. What the Luftwaffe did not understand, until it was too late, was the cost of its own certainty. While they believed they were fighting against an inferior group, they faced a force shaped precisely by the need not to fail, a system that, forced by segregation, had become improvisationally tested. And it was exactly this system that, in the following month, would cause the first real write-off. A veteran German pilot would be shot down by a gust from an aging P-40, driven by a man who, until then, was not even considered worthy of being in the air. But what happened after that first slaughter was not just a victory. It was the beginning of a narrative and tactical collapse that the Luftwaffe never foresaw. The first time Luftwaffe pilots heard of the 99th Fighter Squadron was through the intercepted Allied communiques. The messages mentioned a new escort unit operating in North Africa. No distinct symbols, no combat reputation, no known aces. Just a bureaucratic note: Black Squadron, flying P-40s. For the Germans, this did not require attention. It wasn't a threat. It was a distraction. Some reports collected after the war indicate that, in the Luftwaffe messes, the subject generated muffled laughter. One of the comments attributed to Major Adolf Galland, back in 1943, said, "If the Americans are training Negroes to fly, then the war is already lost." For them, the irony had barely begun. On June 2, 1943, the 99th received its first real combat mission, to support the bombardment of the island of Pantelleria in the Mediterranean Sea. The aim was to test German defenses before an Allied advance into Sicily. The Luftwaffe expected light action. He did not send reinforcements. The 99th, with its worn-out P-40 Warhawks and liquid-cooled engines, took off at dawn. The mission was clear: maintain formation, protect bombers, avoid unnecessary engagement. It was an active observation mission, a military translation for a task with no strategic relevance. But that day, the squad did exactly what it was ordered. No bombers were lost. No driver abandoned his position. And the Luftwaffe, even though it was present in smaller numbers, was unable to break through the protective screen set up by the black unit. The American reports highlighted the disciplined behavior of the formation. The German reports mentioned almost nothing. For both sides, the mission was small, but for the Red Tails, that flight was a milestone. They had taken part in actual combat, performed their task accurately, and returned intact. It was the first step. Even so, recognition was non-existent. Colonel William Momyer, commander of the group to which the 99th was subordinate, downplayed the feat. He continued to assign the unit to secondary missions, convinced that the absence of errors was more luck than ability. This conviction would be shaken little by little. Mission after mission, reports showed that Tuskegee pilots didn't just follow orders, they carried them out with fewer incidents than veteran units. They maintained their position. They avoided friendly fire. They flew in formation. The doctrine of the 99th was beginning to show itself superior not by boldness but by constancy. The difference in operating culture was visible. While many units of the time cultivated individualism and celebrated solitary aces, the 99th operated as a collective structure. The pilots knew they weren't just defending bombers. They were defending the right to exist. The Luftwaffe, however, remained blind to this. For the Germans, the red-tailed formations had no symbolic value. They were just escort fighters. If they were flown by blacks, that was irrelevant. Or rather, it was a sign of the enemy's structural weakness. Nazi doctrine held that air warfare was won by genius and aggressiveness, not by discipline and obedience. Hermann Göring himself had declared in 1940 that a true pilot hunts with instinct, not with orders. It was a philosophy that worked well against disorganized opponents, but would become a mortal weakness against structures based on repetition, training, and method. And the Red Tails were exactly that. Method. They did not hunt the enemy. They protected the targets. They fulfilled the mission. And as the months went by, this approach began to attract attention. Bomber crews went on to report that the red-tailed fighters stayed around all the time. Unlike other groups, which often moved away to seek kills, the Tuskegee pilots held their position even under attack. This was unusual, and in the data, it began to appear. In escort missions under the responsibility of the 99th, the loss rate dropped. Not much, still below 1 percentage point, but it fell steadily. Luftwaffe intelligence officers, for their part, were more concerned about the advance of bombing raids over mainland Italy. The reports focused on the increasing amount of B-17s and B-24s crossing the Adriatic. Few, if any, paid attention to the escort fighters. And even fewer noticed that a specific unit was beginning to repeat itself in the records. A group with consistent defensive tactics, flying in tight formation, with an almost robotic technical behavior. The Luftwaffe did not know it yet, but it was already facing an enemy that did not fit its logic. Slaughter would come soon, and when it did, it wouldn't just be a death in the air, it would be the collapse of a belief. Because the pilot who would fire that burst was not a white ace nor an heir to a military school. He was a young black man from Indiana, trained by a system that wanted to see him fail. He flew an old P-40, but at that moment, I had altitude, position, and my finger on the trigger. And the Sicilian sky was about to know the name of Charles Hall. July 2nd, 1943. Skies over the Castel Vetrano airfield. Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, on his 8th combat mission, flew a P-40L Warhawk, an aircraft already considered technically inferior to German fighters. Even so, Hall maintained his formation, escorting B-25 bombers after the cargo was released. That's when 2 Focke-Wulf 190s appeared in the visual field, in a wide curve, trying to isolate the slower bombers. Hall broke the discipline of queuing to intercept. It raised its altitude, used the angle of the sun in its favor, and dived in an oblique position with a slight inclination to the left, the so-called reverse split S. Focke-Wulf never saw him approaching. Within seconds, the Warhawk's 50 caliber Browning machine gun ripped through the fuselage of the enemy fighter, starting a flaming spiral to the ground. Witnesses at the base reported that the impact of the news was immediate, not by the number, but by the name. A black pilot flying a worn-out fighter had just brought down one of the prides of German engineering. The swastika painted on Hall's Warhawk marked more than a kill. It was the first confirmed aerial victory by an African-American pilot in U.S. history. The base erupted in celebration. For the black floor teams who had endured derision, insults, and isolation for months, Hall's victory was more than symbolic. It was reparation. The tense silence in the white tents that night was not one of contempt. It was one of surprise. The experiment had just proved deadly. Tactically, Hall executed the basics to perfection. Height superiority, invisible approach, short and effective shooting. He didn't improvise, he applied doctrine. A doctrine that had been tested in Tuskegee to the limit. Every simulation, every repetition, every instruction carried out without challenge had created a standard of technical excellence that now proved fatal to the enemy. The Luftwaffe did not expect any of this. Up to that point, The presence of the Red Tails was irrelevant to their strategists. After the slaughter, the reports began. The name of the 99th Squadron appeared most frequently in interception records, but it was still treated as an anomaly. For the Germans, it was more plausible to believe in isolated luck than to recognize that an entire unit, made up of men who did not fit their racial theory, could pose a real threat. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, but the doctrine was blinding. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Hall's slaughter was only the first. In the following days, other drivers began to show similar results. Strict discipline, technical actions, mutual support. The Red Tails were becoming more than a segregated squadron. They were becoming a working model of tactical efficiency. And while the American High Command still resisted admitting it, the Luftwaffe was beginning to take notice. The pilot shot down by Hall belonged to a unit considered elite, trained in occupied France and supplied with the best resources that Germany could still offer. His death, recorded without glory, was the first indication that something was out of the ordinary. What the Germans called an American command error was turning into a systematic threat, but Washington's response would not be applause. It would be distrust, and the 99th, instead of being raised, was put to the test. An official report would allege a lack of aggressiveness, and the risk of disbanding the squadron would hang over its pilots, even after proven victories, because in the end, the war they were waging was not just against the enemy in the air, it was also against the Allies themselves on land, and it would be in Anzio that this internal confrontation would reach its peak. In the summer of 1943, as the African front unfolded towards southern Europe, two war machines operated under opposing logics. On the one hand, German industry was showing visible signs of exhaustion. Allied bombing paralyzed factories, strangled parts production, and disrupted critical supply chains. On the other hand, the American machine was reaching its industrial maturity, with more than 2.3 million workers employed in aeronautical production alone. The United States produced more aircraft in a single month than Germany produced in an entire quarter. Still, not all of that abundance made it to the front lines, and it definitely didn't get to the Red Tails first. The pilots of the 99th continued to fly the P-40 Warhawks, resistant but technologically outdated fighters, while other units received modern P-47 Thunderbolts and later P-51 Mustangs. Tuskegee's men operated with what was left, and even so, they delivered results. This performance was not a miracle. It was precision human engineering. Behind every successful mission was a support chain composed entirely of technicians, gunsmiths, radio operators, and mechanics, all of whom were black, men who knew they wouldn't have a second chance to make mistakes. Every engine repaired, every sight calibration, every part replacement was done with second-rate tooling and frequently repurposed parts. Scarcity was transformed into discipline. The limitation turned into efficiency. And the statistics reflected this. The operational availability rate of Red Tails aircraft, that is, the percentage of fighters ready for combat at any given time, equaled, and at certain times exceeded, that of better-equipped white squadrons. A remarkable feat, considering that the 99th was often last in line for supply distribution. The logic behind this technical excellence was the same that shaped the performance of the drivers. There was a collective awareness that any failure would be attributed, not to a mechanical error, but to a supposed racial inferiority. This imposed an additional layer of surveillance, almost obsessive, over every detail of the operation. Tuskegee Field Commander Colonel Noel Parrish himself stated in internal reports that ground crews have developed a maintenance standard worthy of technical study by the Air Force. It was an excellence born not of privilege, but of institutional survival. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe faced the opposite. The loss of territory and the increasing pressure of strategic bombing began to erode Germany's ability to keep its fighters in the air. The shortage of parts and trained technicians reduced the availability rate of fleets. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had already lost more than 2,000 aircraft on the Eastern Front and more than 1,000 in the skies over Western Europe. Replacing them required a pace that not even the totalitarian regime could impose. In the skies of Sicily, this translated into numbers. German fighters flew less. The Red Tails P-40s flew more. White supremacy, when confronted with logistical reality, was beginning to crumble. The Luftwaffe still believed that it faced an anomaly. He didn't understand that the Red Tail's success was the result of a disciplined system, not luck. I still didn't understand that I was facing a unit trained as an exception, but forged to be standard. American logic, even within segregation, was still superior on one vital point: scale. What the Germans tried to compensate for with technological innovation, the United States solved with volume, standardization, and uninterrupted maintenance. The Red Tails, even relegated to the leftovers, were still within this immense gear, and they learned to trade with the minimum, making the minimum yield the maximum. In an internal letter sent by the Logistics Command of the 15th Air Force in October 1943, an officer noted, "If this unit continues to operate at this rate of readiness, even with limited resources, it will be necessary to revise our priority criteria." But the revision would not come anytime soon. Even with proven technical performance, the 99th remained isolated. Every spare part, every spare engine, every calibrated armament required more time, more justification, more explanations. The answer was always the same: do more with less. And they did. Between June and December 1943, the 99th Squadron flew 126 missions. The number was almost double that of some white groups that had recently arrived in European theater. And the rate of return, that is, missions successfully completed without losing bombers, was significantly higher. The irony was cruel. The men who had no right to share the mess hall with their white counterparts were delivering better results with older aircraft, fewer parts, less support, and no margin for error. In any other war, this would have made headlines. But in that one, it was still a hidden statistic. Reports were filed, internal praise did not turn into promotion, and the machine that segregated kept turning. Still, the machine flew, and it flew with precision. What the Germans ignored was that each Warhawk taking off with a black pilot ahead carried more than fuel. It carried the living denial of the enemy's racial ideology. In each mission accomplished, in each plane returned without damage, the logic of the Reich was slowly dismantled, not with speeches but with results. And it would be in the skies of Anzio that this dismantling would become inevitable, because there, for the first time, the Luftwaffe would face the 99th head-to-head, and would emerge numerically inferior. On January 27, 1944, over the beaches taken from Anzio, the 99th Fighter Squadron was launched into the vortex of a firestorm. Allied forces had established a vital beachhead off the coast of Italy, and the Luftwaffe was determined to destroy it. The German air attack was massive, coordinated and supported by Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, among the most formidable in the Reich fleet. On the other hand, Tuskegee's Red Tails continued to fly Warhawk P-40s, robust fighters, but already considered obsolete compared to the agility and power of the FW-190s. It would be, in German eyes, a massacre, but it was on this air battlefield that the 99th Squadron sealed its transition from social experiment to combat-validated military unit. The secret wasn't in the planes, it was in the doctrine. The Tuskegee pilots had abandoned any operational vanity in exchange for collective discipline. The three-tier training, developed in the grueling training sessions in Alabama, has proven its effectiveness. The first layer kept a close escort to the bombers, protecting them from frontal attacks. The second intercepted lateral approaches, while the third identified dives and flanks. This defensive architecture required impeccable communication, space reading, and absolute trust among pilots. Qualities rare in newly formed squadrons, but abundant among the Red Tails. The result was immediate. During 2 days of continuous combat, the 99th shot down between 8 and 13 German aircraft depending on the source. Charles Hall, already a hero for his first kill months earlier, added 2 more wins to his record. In a scenario where collapse was expected, what was seen was the operational cohesion of a unit that, even without the best equipment, made every maneuver, every ammunition, every flight, perform. The U.S. Air Force began an emergency study after Anzio. Comparing the performance of the 99th with other squadrons equipped with P-40s, the report concluded that the success rate is statistically indistinguishable from the most experienced white units. It was the tacit recognition that the combat effectiveness of the Red Tails was not a coincidence. It was doctrine. It was training. It was logistics working despite segregation. While the Luftwaffe relied more and more on its mystique, legendary aces and jets yet to come, the Tuskegee Airmen built their reputation on maintenance spreadsheets, standardized tactical schemes, and an operational ethic based on precision. The victories at Anzio not only silenced internal critics but also put the name Tuskegee on the Luftwaffe's radar. For the first time, reports intercepted by intelligence services revealed mentions of a fighter unit with unusual visual markers, an early reference to future red-tailed Mustangs. What started as a joke now generated caution. Behind the scenes of the Italian campaign, the narrative has changed. Senior Air Force officers, once skeptical, began requesting that the 99th be kept in theaters closer to the front line. The performance at Anzio had proven that the squad was not only functional, but necessary. Still, institutional discrimination persisted. The 99th received no immediate official decorations. He was not invited to parades or public recognitions. The bureaucratic machine that accepted its results still refused to accept its full existence. But as usual, the data spoke louder than the speeches, and the figures showed that the Luftwaffe, until then proud of its air supremacy, had suffered a moral breakdown. There was a new force in the skies over Europe, disciplined, resilient, invisible to propaganda but visible in casualties. In a radio intercept recorded weeks after Anzio, a German pilot described his frustration. "These black fighters, they don't follow us. They just protect the bombers like guard dogs." The phrase unwittingly summed up the principle of combat that Benjamin O. Davis Jr. had instilled in his unit. Protect, not pursue. Glory would come as a consequence of the mission, never as its goal. This philosophy, austere, functional, and extremely effective, would be taken to its apex with the arrival of the P-51 Mustangs and the integration of the 332nd Fighter Group. But before that, a new phase was approaching, a visual identification system that would make red tails immediately recognizable in the skies of Europe, a system that would transform them from operational legend to visual icon. May 1944. The 332nd Fighter Group goes into operation, unifying the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Squadrons into a single cohesive force. It was not just an administrative reorganization. It was the formalization of what the front line already knew. The Tuskegee pilots had overcome the barriers imposed not only by the Luftwaffe, but by the segregationist structure of the United States itself. The new lineup was accompanied by a strategic visual decision. The Air Force has implemented a color-coded fighter identification system, a necessary measure to facilitate reconnaissance during escort missions. The 332nd was assigned the color red, applied not only to discrete stripes, but to the entire tail of the P-51 Mustang. The result was immediate. Fighters with red tails, propellers with scarlet spinners, and visual details that made them unmistakable in the skies of Europe. The definitive symbol of the red tails was born. What once made a difference, color, segregation, isolation, now became a benchmark of excellence. The adoption of the P-51 Mustang represented more than a technical leap. It was a logistical divider. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang was fast, tough, and had a range of more than 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers, with auxiliary tanks, enough to escort bombers to the edge of German territory and bring them back. His 6 Browning 50 cal machine guns were accurate, lethal, and could withstand long bursts in high-velocity engagements. In tactical terms, the 332nd went on to operate with the best escort fighter of the war. The irony was inevitable. A unit initially armed with outdated aircraft, treated as an experiment and last in line for parts and supplies, now flew the technological jewel of American aviation. The contrast with the Luftwaffe was increasingly brutal. While Germany tried to make up for its losses with unfinished jets, fuel shortages, and inexperienced pilots, the Red Tails flew superior machines, fueled by a logistics system that mass-produced and delivered accurately. To get an idea of the scale, the American industry produced about 96,000 aircraft per year at the height of the war. The Luftwaffe, exhausted by bombing raids and internal collapse, could barely keep 15,000 in operation in the same period. This difference is not only numerical, it is structural. And if you were surprised by this disproportion, 6 times higher production, regular maintenance, and pilots with more flight hours, write in the comments, "Logistics wins." Because that's exactly what happened. With the 302nd fully operational and now equipped with Mustangs, bomber crews began to realize something that the high command would be slow to recognize. The red-tailed fighters didn't just do their job, they did it with frightening precision. Unlike other units, which often abandoned bombers to pursue individual victories, the Red Tails maintained the escort until the end. They protected the flanks, flew in tight formation, and returned even after the most intense engagements. Quickly, a phrase spread among the crew of the B-17s and B-24s. If you have a choice, ask for the red-tailed ones. For men facing flak at 9,000 meters and surprise attacks at 700 km/h, this loyalty was more valuable than any medal. It was the difference between returning home or not. The statistic did not lie. The average number of bombers lost under Red Tail's escort was only 0.68 per mission, compared to 1.1 for the other units of the 15th Air Force. In practice, this meant dozens of lives saved over the course of each campaign. What's more, this occurred even when the 332nd was assigned to the longest and most dangerous missions of the war. The discipline of the unit was such that it began to attract attention outside the theater of operations. Staff officers began to study their training methods, their response patterns, and the tight control imposed by Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who strictly forbade his men to break formation. "Our mission is not to be aces, it's bringing the bombers back," Davis repeated. This ethos, simple, objective, ruthless, contrasted with the culture of the cult of the individual pilot promoted by both the Luftwaffe and other American groups. While some still counted kills, the Red Tails counted returns, and each return represented more than a military victory. It represented a symbolic defeat for the ideology that had rejected them. The Luftwaffe, now in a defensive position, began to identify the red-tailed Mustangs in their reports. They were called the Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen, a nickname loaded with contempt that over time came to be uttered with cautious respect, because where these planes appeared, the losses increased. Where these fighters escorted, the bombardments reached the target. The symbology of the red tail had surpassed the color barriers. It was no longer just a mark of segregation. It was synonymous with efficiency, an unofficial code for mission accomplished. But the war was not yet over, and the Red Tails would be put to the test like never before, because on the horizon loomed a new threat. The first jet fighters in history, the Messerschmitt Me 262, faster, more powerful, and considered invincible, until they crossed paths with the red-tailed fighters. By 1944, the transformation was already evident. What had begun as a social experiment tolerated for electoral convenience now dictated combat doctrine in the middle of Europe. The 332nd Fighter Group, known to the Allies as the Red Tails and to the Germans as Schwarze Vogelflieger, the Black Aviators, had gone from being a military anomaly to becoming a benchmark of efficiency. The policy imposed by Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. did not accept deviations. The mission was to escort bombers, not hunt for glory. This simple and straightforward doctrine clashed with the mindset of several traditional units, which often prioritized racking up personal victories, even at the cost of leaving bombers exposed. The practical result of this philosophy? Statistically undeniable. By the end of the European campaign, the Red Tails had the lowest bomb loss rate in the 15th Air Force. Only 27 bombers shot down under their escort, versus an average of 46 in equivalent units. The constancy of this protection translated into trust. Entire groups of bombers, initially skeptical or even hostile, began requesting the Red Tails as a priority escort. It didn't matter what color the drivers were. It mattered to go home. This change in perception did not come only from statistics. It came from the battlefield, where white pilots saw with their own eyes the red-tailed Mustangs face bursts of flak, FW-190 dives, and even solitary Me-109 chases, always with the same tactical discipline: protect the formation, maintain the integrity of the convoy, accomplish the mission. Davis's doctrine made the squadron predictable, and that, in a scenario where chaos was the norm, was a strategic relief. The irony was thick as engine smoke. Pilots who had been trained out of political necessity, kept in inferior aircraft and assigned to secondary missions, were now considered essential. They didn't just meet the standards, they redefined what was expected of an air escort. On the enemy side, the reconnaissance came quietly but clearly. Luftwaffe interceptions began to treat the formations escorted by Red Tails with more caution. Intercepted reports revealed that German units avoided direct confrontation when they identified the Red Tails. Tactical surprise had turned into institutional fear. A Luftwaffe commander, in a letter preserved in the post-war archives, described the Red Tails as Extremely disciplined, ruthless in defense, and ineffective as a target for distraction. In other words, they did not allow themselves to be provoked, and that made them more dangerous than any glory-hungry ace. That reputation, built on hundreds of missions, has been cemented with sweat, oil, and blood. The Red Tails formation system, which Davis implemented from the base at Ramitelli, required 3 layers of cover: the direct contact escort, which flew close to the bombers; the interception escort, which flew slightly ahead and intercepted threats coming from high angles; and the dive escort, which specialized in identifying attacks by German fighters that appeared from below. This organization required millimeter precision, and the Tuskegee-trained pilots, with up to 50% more flight hours than the national average, were masters of tactical execution. The result was a real air shield. Instead of fragmenting the defense into individual initiatives as many units did, the Red Tails created a movable wall, adjusting according to the positioning of the bombers. And even in the face of the temptation to chase a FW-190 that was fleeing downhill, they kept in formation. "We are not here to kill, we are here to protect." The phrase was repeated like a mantra. The doctrine was clear, and the results were incontestable. For the United States, this was a brutal and at the same time uncomfortable validation. After all, the Red Tails proved their technical excellence in a system that, until then, doubted even their ability to operate a cabin radio. The victory of the red-tailed hunters was more than aerial. It was strategic, doctrinal, moral. They forced the U.S. Army to revise its certainties, not out of policy, but out of necessity. When the survival of the bombers, and consequently, the strategic bombing campaign, came to depend on the escort, the color of the skin no longer mattered. And in Germany, where racial doctrine saw blacks as biologically incapable of mastering aviation, the name Schwarzer Vogelflieger gained another weight, that of humiliation, because the one who dominated the sky now was exactly the one who, according to his manuals, should never have taken off. But the heavens still held one last battle. Berlin, a 1,600-mile mission, the largest escort ever attempted by the 15th Air Force. And this time, the Luftwaffe would not come with propellers, but with jets. March 24, 1945. The sky over Germany was an invisible field of tension. The mission of the day was clear: to escort more than 1,300 B-17 and B-24 bombers to the heart of the Reich, Berlin. It would be the 15th Air Force's largest escorted bombing mission to date. But there was an unprecedented threat: the emergence of the Luftwaffe's Me-262 jet fighters, Hitler's secret weapon for reversing the air war. Fast, almost unreachable, these planes could reach up to 870 km/h, 200 km/h faster than any piston-engine fighter. In theory, they were invincible, but theory does not bring down a plane. The 332nd Fighter Group, the Red Tails, was assigned to one of the main escorts, now armed with P-51D Mustangs and equipped with the new K-14 computer targeting system. The pilots had trained exhaustively for this moment. The K-14, an American innovation based on gyroscopic principles, allowed it to automatically calculate the firing point based on the enemy's speed and angle of turn, something crucial against targets that flew too fast for traditional aiming. But the equipment alone was not enough. For weeks, the Red Tails studied the behavior patterns of German jets. They found that, despite superior speed, the Me-262s had 2 operational weaknesses. They accelerated slowly when taking off, and drastically reduced maneuverability when decelerating to engage targets. This made them vulnerable at very specific times, especially on approach to attack the bombers when they needed to line up their fire. It was in this interval that the doctrine would come into action. The plan was simple and lethal: divide the group into 3 escort layers, as always, but deploy rotating wings of fighters with specific orders to visually track the jets, anticipate their dive, and block the line of attack. When the Me-262s appeared, gleaming, silent, and confident, they hoped to repeat the pattern that had been working: attack at speed, fire, disappear. But they didn't count on the wall of red Mustangs ahead of the bombers. Within seconds, Captain Roscoe Brown Jr. identified a Me-262 approaching the formation. Instead of chasing him after the attack, as other riders did, he sped off to intercept his exit turn. The jet tried to move away, but with the limited angle of climb, it was exposed for long enough. Brown locked the K-14, compensated for speed, and fired. The tail of the Me-262 burst into flames, and for the first time a fighter jet was shot down by a black pilot. Minutes later, another pilot, Lieutenant Earl Lane, would apply the same logic. He waited for the jet to approach the B-24s, positioned itself below the line of fire, ascended in an arc, and fired in a cross trajectory. The second jet crashed before reaching escape altitude. A third, shot down by Lieutenant William Holloman, dived to evade the escort, but was hit in the left wing before leaving the contact zone. 3 Me-262s destroyed in a single mission, by the hands of a unit that, 2 years earlier, was not even authorized to use the same bathroom as the white officers. The Red Tails proved that discipline, tactical intelligence, and technical mastery were capable of neutralizing even the most advanced enemy weapon. The mission was completed with minimal losses. Most of the bombers reached the target and back. For the first time, German jets were stopped not by speed but by strategy. The Luftwaffe's reports from that day were laconic: unexpected interference, aggressive resistance. Mustang's position compromised the attacks. General Adolf Galland, head of Luftwaffe fighters, would later write, "The Me-262 was superior in speed, but not in war." The ultimate symbol of the Reich's technological pride had been slaughtered by men who, in the eyes of Nazi doctrine, were not even supposed to fly. It was the moral collapse of an ideology sustained by technical supremacy, overthrown by a squad born of segregation, but forged in logic, training, and discipline. The red-tailed fighters didn't just survive the mission, they defined it, and from then on there would be no turning back. Because now, even the jets knew, Europe's skies had new owners, and what came next would seal that dominance unquestionably, with the total kill count and the mark that would put the Red Tails in the eternity of military aviation. In the sweltering heat of the Italian plains, far from the spotlight of aerial glory, operated the silent cog that underpinned every mission of the Red Tails. Ground operators, black men, like the pilots who protected the skies, but even more invisible. They did not appear in the newspapers. They did not receive medals. They did not have their names recorded in slaughter counts. But without them, no P-51 Mustang would have even left the runway. The 332nd Fighter Group's base of operations at Ramitelli was small, remote, and constantly threatened by attack. Unlike other units which relied on organized sheds, spare parts in stock, and regular supplies, the Red Tails operated with minimal broken parts were reused. Auxiliary tanks were patched by hand. Tires, often bald, were changed between fighters in the early mornings. And yet, the data is impressive. The operational availability rate of the 332nd Mustangs remained among the highest in the entire 15th Air Force, above 85%, while other white units fluctuated between 70% and 80%, even with more abundant resources. This index was not by chance, it was sweat. It was method. It was the result of the obsessive work of team bosses like Alfred Thomas and ship owners like Robert Lee, who assembled weapons systems under the light of flashlights and under the pressure of stopwatches. Each flight completed was a logistical miracle, and these miracles were repeated more than 15,000 times during the war. On one of the most critical days of the bombing campaign, March 10, 1945, a surprise Luftwaffe attack struck Ramitelli airfield. Fragments of incendiary bombs hit the fuel sector and threatened to detonate the row of fighters prepared to take off. There was no panic, just action. In less than 4 minutes, 6 Mustangs were manually pulled out of the impact zone by mechanics working without weapons, without orders, and without time. One of them, Joseph Gomer, burned both hands when he touched the red-hot fuselage. He was not a pilot. It never flew. But it saved more planes than many aces. These men were trained to diagnose faults with their ears, adjust carburetors in the rain, and do what no doctrine predicted: maintain an active fighting force with 40% fewer spare parts. And it wasn't just technical skill, it was logistical discipline. The 382nd's maintenance system adopted duplicate manual records, fixed inspection schedules, and a culture of redundancy. Each component checked by 2 pairs of eyes. Each armament tested 3 times before takeoff. The confidence of the drivers came from this ground. They knew that by sitting in the cabin they did not fly alone. They carried the work of dozens of hands that, even though they did not cross the skies, shaped the outcome of the mission. The irony is brutal. While the Luftwaffe suffered from fuel shortages, sabotaged parts, and bombed-out assembly lines, the Red Tails maintained a cohesive force with inferior resources and under internal segregation. Logistically, they operated as a parallel army, invisible and resilient. In 1944, the 15th Air Force Command itself sent a classified report to the Pentagon praising the exceptional rate of availability of Ramitelli-based units, especially under unfavorable environmental and logistical conditions. But even that was not enough for black ground operators to be promoted or received equally after the war. Their names remained on technical lists, not monuments, but his contribution was recorded in the marks of every returning Mustang, in the repaired hulls, in the engines that roared in the morning. It was the silent triumph of efficiency, a reminder that the American war machine, when driven by merit and discipline, even under the weight of prejudice, could be invincible. And when these men worked together, like cogs of one purpose, they didn't just sustain the flight, they sustained the story. General Ira Eaker himself, in a March 1945 dispatch, summed it up in one sentence: "I have never seen a unit do so much with so little." But the little, on that dirt field, was everything, and with it, the Red Tails would take off for their final mission, and for their official consecration as a combat elite. Because what would come next would not only be the closing of the campaign, it would be the verdict of history. And the Luftwaffe, once proud of its aces and jets, would have to admit, quietly, that it underestimated the impossible. On August 30th, 1944, Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson was shot down over French territory during an escort mission and imprisoned by German troops. Captured as a prisoner of war, he awaited the standard treatment reserved for Allied pilots: isolation, interrogation, and, hopefully, transfer to an officer's camp. But what he found was something much more unsettling. When he was taken to the interrogation room, he was called by his full name. The German officer in front of him did not have to ask his origin. He knew his father's name, his hometown, the exact structure of the base at Ramitelli, the organization of the 15th Air Force, and in detail the specific role of the Red Tails in escort missions. "You are the red-tailed black Americans," he said, with the coolness of someone who has studied his opponent thoroughly. The card was already written: Schwarze Vogelflieger, the Black Birdmen. The designation that began as a trench joke had become a technical category in Luftwaffe reports. The Germans knew who they were, what they did, and most importantly, they knew what they meant. The enemy's reconnaissance was clear. The 382nd Fighter Group was no longer treated as an anomaly. It was considered a force specialized in interception and defense of bombers. A unit with a distinct tactical pattern, disciplined, predictable, and therefore lethal. Nazi intelligence even recorded in internal documents that the red-tailed formations exhibited ruthless escort behavior, difficult to break through without loss. This means that at the height of the war, when Germany was trying to contain the Allied offensive, they prioritized studying the doctrine of a unity that the United States itself still marginalized. The irony was brutal. Within the American military structure itself, the Red Tails did not have access to the same clubs, infirmaries, or even dining halls as the other pilots. They were segregated on land, but revered in heaven. In Ramitelli, they knew that. The order was clear: fly as if each mission were a declaration of identity, and each victory an argument against ignorance. And the data confirms it. Of the more than 15,000 flights flown by the group, with 112 confirmed aerial victories, no bombers were lost to abandonment of escort, a record that no other unit has equaled. It is impossible to ignore the statistic that the Germans, with all their war machine and racial doctrine, tried to deny. The most disciplined, most effective, and most feared unit of the American air escort was made up of men who, for the system, should not even be in the air. One of the most striking proofs of the tactical respect that the Red Tails commanded came with the interception of communications between Luftwaffe fighters. On several occasions, when visually identifying red-tailed P-51s, German pilots were heard altering routes, avoiding direct engagements or calling for reinforcements. An Allied intelligence report recorded, "The presence of red-tailed Mustangs causes changes in the enemy's attack pattern. Consider tactical priority." If you were surprised by this reality, that the Germans knew better, feared more, and respected the Red Tails more than many American officers, comment now. Shocking data. Because war sometimes reveals more about those who observe than about those who fight. The figure of Lieutenant Jefferson, silently listening to his enemy recite confidential information about his life and his unit, is the exact portrait of the moral contradiction of the war. For the Luftwaffe, he was a strategic target. For his own country, it was still just an experiment. But the gears of history do not stop. The enemy's reconnaissance wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a larger reassessment. Because the more the Red Tails won, the more impossible it became to maintain the official narrative of inferiority. And soon, the American High Command would have to answer the question it avoided for years. What to do with heroes who prove, with statistics, what ideology denied. In the late spring of 1945, as the skies over Europe began to clear for the Allies, an expression began to circulate frequently among the crews of the B-17 and B-24 bombers. Red-tailed angels. It was said in a low voice, in a tone of relief, just after the engines of the four-engine engines were turned off, and the men jumped out of the fuselage with their bodies intact. It was not an official nickname, nor promoted by army campaigns. It was a name born in the line of fire, forged by glances exchanged at 25,000 feet altitude, when the Red Tails appeared from the rear, firm, silent, unshaken. The Red Tails' reputation among bombers was not born with speeches, but with numbers, and with actions. During missions over Vienna, Munich, and Berlin, reports were repeated, enemy fighters approaching, formations breaking up, crews panicking, until the red-tailed P-51s went into action. But there was one detail that made them different. While other units broke formation to chase fleeing fighters, the Red Tails remained in position. Even when the opportunity for easy culling arose, they stayed, and so they came back together. This did not go unnoticed. In 1944, the 15th Air Force Command began formally registering orders from bomber units requesting the Red Tails as a priority escort. It was unheard of. White crews, many of them from the most segregationist states in the U.S., writing formal memos asking to fly alongside black pilots. And the justification was objective, the lowest loss rate of the entire Air Force. Statistically, flying with the Red Tails increased the chances of return by up to 30%. But the most impressive statistic came from a February 1945 report. Of the 179 full escort missions flown by the Red Tails up to that point, only 27 bombers had been lost in direct combat with fighters, a proportion of losses that no other escort unit, white or mixed, has been able to reach. Confidence was such that some damaged B-17 crew members reported waiting for the Red Tails before aborting the formation. They knew that if they could stay the course for a few more minutes, the red-tailed Mustangs would come, and they would be here to stay. One of these accounts, by Gunnery Sergeant James Wilcox, was recorded in a diary. We separated from the formation. The FW-190s came out on top. We were ready to jump, but then we saw the Red Tails in formation. They didn't say anything. They did not signal. They just flew beside us like walls. We returned home with 2 engines and a miracle escort. This miracle was not spiritual. It was doctrinaire. The order from Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. remained unchanged. Stay with the bombers, even if it means letting targets slip away, even if it costs individual glory, because the mission was not to slaughter. The mission was to protect, and protecting meant surviving. And surviving, in the midst of total war, meant creating legend. The Red Tails began to appear in notes, letters, and oral accounts as the guardians, the ones who never left us, the ones who kept their promises. It didn't matter what color the skin was. The consistency of the results mattered. Pilots who had never exchanged a word with their protégés began to write letters thanking them, to visit bases in Ramitelli, to shake calloused hands with black mechanics. The perception began to change, not out of institutional obligation, but for survival. Because at the most critical moment of the mission, it wasn't the color of the pilot that mattered. It was the color of the tail. And if it was red, hope was reborn. It is at this point that historical irony reaches its maximum strength. In a segregated army where blacks could not share quarters with whites, it was black airmen who saved the most white lives in the skies. Prejudice gave way to gratitude, and gratitude gave way to reverence. If you've come this far and been surprised by this silent reversal of values, comment now. Logistics wins. Because this victory was not built on slogans. It was erected with precise maintenance, ruthless doctrine, and tactical courage. But not everyone accepted this change. To some in the high command, the Red Tails were a political problem masquerading as a military solution. And when the war was over, what to do with a unit that proved, with data, that everything it had been taught about race and ability was wrong. The answer would come not from the battlefield, but from the court of memory, and it would begin to be written in the United States itself. The day of victory has arrived. Germany officially surrendered in May 1945. Europe silenced its guns, and thousands of American soldiers returned home to heroic cheers, parades, and headlines. But not all. For the Red Tails, the return was another kind of landing. The same men who had faced German jets with Mustangs prepared on dirt, who had protected hundreds of bombers with surgical precision, who had defeated a racist doctrine with discipline and excellence, were greeted with indifference. Alexander Jefferson, the same pilot captured and interrogated by German officers who knew him by name and respected his unit, was released from a prison camp at Stalag Luft III, not for military reasons, but for its color. No parade, no official handshake, no general to thank. While other units were honored with bands and public decorations, the Tuskegees returned to segregated America and encountered the same prejudice they had left when they left. Some were barred from hotels, others barred from enlisting in the regular Air Force. White officers who had fought alongside them in the skies refused to share a mess hall on land. The war was over for Europe, but not for them. The irony was unbearable. In defeated Germany, prisoners were recognized and interrogated on the basis of military merit. In the victorious United States, they were only men of color, the moral elite of the air, now invisible on the streets of their own country. The statistics, however, could not be ignored. The 332nd Fighter Group flew more than 15,000 sorties, shot down 112 confirmed enemy aircraft, escorted bombers on some of the most dangerous routes of the war, and returned with the lowest loss rate of the entire 15th Air Force. Those numbers were in Pentagon reports, but not in the newspapers, not even in school books, not even in the presidential speeches of the time. A heavy, bureaucratic, and systematic silence drowned out the feat, because to admit the victory of the Red Tails was to admit the moral failure of an entire doctrine. It was to recognize that the military hierarchy, and by extension, the American social structure itself, had lied. That black men were, yes, capable of leading, piloting, commanding, and winning, and that they had done so under the worst conditions, with less support, less recognition, and more obstacles. In 1946, many of the Tuskegee Airmen were discharged. Some returned to work as porters, others as mechanics in civilian workshops. Few were reabsorbed by the armed forces. None was promoted to general at that time. The country they protected was not yet ready to be protected by them. One journalist even wrote, "If the Red Tails had painted their tails white, they might have been invited to the parade." The phrase, though cynical, reflected a brutal truth. The color that distinguished them in the sky, and made them legend among bombers, was still used to separate them on land. And even so, none of them renounced the uniform. None abandoned the commitment. They had won the Reich, and they knew that the moral war that remained would be longer, because it was not fought with ammunition but with memory. And the memory in the following years would begin to move, first slowly, then with force, until the moment came when even the most skeptical would be forced to acknowledge the obvious, that these men were no exception. They were the proof, and that proof was about to become a historic verdict. Between 1944 and 1945, as the Luftwaffe operated under increasing pressure, and its tactical formations began to fragment, a quiet and meticulous doctrine established itself as a benchmark among the skies of Europe. It did not come from old manuals, nor from heroes consecrated by the military press. It was born in the cold pragmatism of Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., commander of the 332nd Fighter Group. The son of one of the first black generals in the United States Army, Davis understood that there was no margin for error, improvisation, or stardom. In a system that expected failure, the only way to win was to deny failure as a possibility. His doctrine was clear. It doesn't matter who you knock down. It matters who you protect. This philosophy operated in every maneuver, in every formation, and in every order transmitted by Ramitelli airfield radios. The 332nd's patrols were made up of 3 tactical layers: a close bomber escort, an intermediate line of interception, and a third of wide coverage. The function was not to directly engage the enemy, but to keep the airspace unfeasible for any effective penetration. Unlike other fighter units which prioritized individual victory counts, the Red Tails functioned as an organism. Nobody broke formation. No one chased an enemy fighter away from the mission. This frustrated young drivers, eager for glory, but the rule was unbreakable. "Do you want a medal or do you want to go home?" said Davis. This thinking, at the time considered restrictive, anticipated the modern principles of space control and air superiority, mastery of the environment, tactical predictability, and synchrony between units. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, was still stuck in a heroic and decentralized model. His aces, such as Galland and Hartmann, operated as lone gunmen. They were lethal, but difficult to coordinate. As fuel became scarce and the number of fighters dwindled, the absence of a collective doctrinal model became fatal. In contrast, the Red Tails, still with inferior resources, compensated with mathematical precision. Each mission was mapped, timed, communicated in 3 simultaneous channels. The bombers knew where the Mustangs would be in each phase of the flight, and they were. Not coincidentally, the mission abortion rate of the B-17s and B-24s escorted by the 322nd was 40% lower than on missions protected by other units. The irony of this story is that the solution to the air war was in front of everyone. Black, segregated, isolated, but operating with doctrine and method. If you're enjoying unraveling these hidden layers of war, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content like this. Because this isn't just a story about airplanes. It is a lesson in command, strategy, and operational predictability. And by the time the Germans finally realized this, it was too late. An internal Luftwaffe report, captured by Allied intelligence at the end of the war, identified the red-tailed formation as a unit of predictable but impenetrable behavior. The term used was diszipliniert aber tödlich, disciplined but lethal, and it is at this point that the doctrine becomes a legacy, because the next battle of the Red Tails would not be in the skies of Europe, but in the halls of American power, where moral discipline would begin to dismantle the gears of institutional prejudice. While the American press ignored the names of the black pilots who crossed the sky of Europe, engineers and technical officers began to take notes. There was something about the Red Tails that could not be explained by discipline or doctrine alone. It was a tactical performance that defied statistics, and above all, it forced practical answers. The 332nd Fighter Group, by operating for long periods with fewer resources, adapted maintenance techniques, armament, and the use of aircraft that would later be incorporated into other units. An early example of this was the advanced use of the K-14 computer targeting system, which was introduced late on the P-51. While other formations still relied on manual optical sighting, the Tuskegee Airmen, accustomed to compensating for technical limitations with study and simulation, began to apply the new system more effectively. Internal reports showed that pilots of the 332nd had, on average, a target lock time 1.8 seconds shorter than other units. That was enough time to win a dogfight. In addition, the squadron's own mechanics have developed field adaptations, using interchangeable parts between fighters to keep aircraft operational under shortage. On some occasions, hybrid configurations of P-51s were mounted with damaged P-47 rear sections, something that in traditional units would be discarded. These improvised solutions, made by black technicians, with less money and almost no visibility, fed into the Air Force's technical reports after the war. The practical experience at Tuskegee began to be studied in military academies as a success story in logistics under pressure, and there was more. In the training exercises, the Red Tails recorded the performance data of each flight with millimeter precision. Each failure was documented, analyzed, and cross-referenced with flight behavior. The result was a technical database that, ironically, put them ahead of units with greater investment. The efficiency of the Mustangs operated by the Red Tails was so superior that in 1945, a report by North American Aviation recommended that pilots of frontline units be sent to Tuskegee to understand the tactical use of certain flap and turn adjustments. And once again, logic imposed itself on ideology. In a country that viewed blacks as incapable of technical thinking, they were the ones who were optimizing systems, adjusting armaments, and using the mathematics of war more accurately. A concrete example emerged in the use of 50 cal incendiary ammunition. The Red Tails realized that, at medium altitudes, the alternating distribution between tracers and incendiaries increased the FW-190's engine breakdown capacity. This empirical observation began to be applied in other formations without credit, but the data was there, and they could not be erased. Because the Red Tails' contribution was not just symbolic. They didn't just fight. They taught. They forced the industry to listen. They forced the designers to rethink. They showed that excellence comes from rigor, not color. And if we now study escort technology, adaptive maintenance, and the integration of piloting and engineering, it's because men like the Tuskegee Airmen had done it before anyone asked them to. In the post-war period, technical officers began to reference the Tuskegee procedures as a model of applied training. The base that was born as an experiment became a reference. What was segregated has become irreplaceable, and if there were still doubts about the impact of these men, they would be buried in silence when the Lockheed and North American engineers themselves asked to consult the mission records of the 332nd, records that revealed something even more shocking. The efficiency rate of the Red Tails in long-distance missions exceeded by 18% that of white units with the same equipment, an efficiency forged in scarcity but sustained by precision. The enemy may have underestimated the color, but the steel of the Mustangs and the brains of those who operated them left no doubt. And if the world didn't already recognize it, one last mission over Austria would show that they didn't just belong in the sky, they had redrawn their roots. 3 years after the official end of World War II, the skies still held the echo of red-tailed Mustangs. But now, the fight was different. In the halls of the Pentagon and in the offices of the White House, classified reports circulated among the president's advisors. Some were signed by high-ranking generals, others by technical evaluation committees, but almost all of them mentioned a name that until a few years earlier was not even accepted in white lodges: Tuskegee. On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the total desegregation of the United States Armed Forces. The document seemed administrative, but its weight was tectonic. For the first time, the Army, Navy, and Air Force would be required to integrate black soldiers and officers on an equal footing with their white counterparts. And at the heart of that decision, amid the moral, diplomatic, and military pressure of the post-war, were the irrefutable results of the Red Tails. It was not an idealistic gesture. It was a consequence. Internal reports showed that the segregated unit with the smallest budget, least support, and least prestige had achieved the best operating rates in the 15th Air Force. The impact of this data crossed with growing criticism from public opinion, which was beginning to question how a country that fought against Nazi racism still kept its troops separated by race, created a pressure that was impossible to ignore. But the transition would not be simple. Within the armed forces, resistance was intense. Conservative officials claimed risk of discipline, culture shock, and even low morale. Squads tried to delay implementation. Barracks ignored the new rule. But the order was signed, and the names that came from the skies of Italy were now registered as incontrovertible arguments of efficiency. In 1954, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the same commander who was forced to eat alone the entire time he studied at West Point, was promoted to brigadier general. He became the first black general in the history of the United States Air Force. His rise was not symbolic. It was strategic. Davis had proven that doctrine, discipline, and planning overcame any prejudice. What's more, he had taught entire generations of pilots to put mission above ego, collectivity above vanity. Truman's decision, even though it was received with criticism from part of American society, had international repercussions. Allied countries cited the measure as a step of moral coherence, and at the newly formed UN, representatives of African descent began to cite the Tuskegee as proof that institutional change was possible. But the biggest change was elsewhere, in the flight academies, in tactics manuals, in leadership courses. The doctrine that was born in Ramatelli, under a tent, with unstable radios and improvised spare parts, was now studied as a model. Logic defeated ideology, and if there were still doubts about the impact of those men, it was enough to open the escort reports of the 15th Air Force: 578 sorties, 112 confirmed wins, no bombers lost under your direct guard on dozens of critical missions. The enemy learned this too late, and his own generals, interrogated after the war, acknowledged the red-tailed pilots were the hardest to break through. A confession, perhaps not of admiration, but of respect. The war was over, but its effects would still shape the power structure for decades. And soon, the Red Tails' children would begin flying supersonic planes, in units that were finally unified. When the war was over, the engines fell silent. The propellers of the red-tailed Mustangs, which once tore through the skies of Europe, were turned off one by one in the forgotten hangars. And with them, the stories of the men who piloted them were also kept, not in museums or textbooks, but in cardboard boxes, basements, and in the silent memory of those who were never invited to speak. For decades, the Tuskegee Airmen were not mentioned in military manuals. Their names rarely appeared in news reports, let alone war films. While white pilots won honors, medals, and biopics, those who had operated with the lowest loss rate in the 15th Air Force watched history being rewritten without their presence. There was no parade. There was no holiday. There was silence. Many of them, when they returned home, simply stopped mentioning what they had done, not out of shame, but out of absolute certainty that no one would believe it. After all, how to convince someone that in the middle of World War II, a squadron made up of black pilots had protected more bombers than any other? How to prove that they had shot down German jets with piston fighters? How can they tell that they were requested by white units that had previously despised them, and now begged them as an escort? The answer: they didn't. Guarded. Until the 90s brought the first signs of revision. Independent researchers, volunteer veterans, and young black officers began to reconstruct the data, to cross-reference forgotten reports, to interview survivors. In 1995, the documentary The Tuskegee Airmen reignited national curiosity, and what was discovered was more than a tactical feat. It was an institutional injustice. More than 900 pilots trained, 15,000 missions flown. The Air Force, under pressure from historians and congressmen, began its own reassessment, and combat reports that were previously filed in technical folders have been reclassified as evidence of operational excellence. In 2007, finally, the U.S. Congress approved the awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian decoration, to the Tuskegee Airmen. On Capitol Hill, President George W. Bush presented the medal to a small group of veterans. Only about 300 were alive. Many arrived in wheelchairs. Others, with their eyes already erased by time, held the hands of their grandchildren who only then heard for the first time what their grandfathers had done. There was no fanfare. There was silence. The same silence with which they had learned to operate under contempt, to fly under skepticism, and to win under anonymity. One of the veterans summed up the feeling by saying, "The enemy has seen us. The country does not." And this was perhaps the greatest paradox in the history of the Red Tails. They were recognized first by the Luftwaffe, then by the very army they swore to protect. But memory, when reconnected to justice, gains a new vector. Schools began to include his achievements in the curricula. The Air Force named programs of excellence in his honor, and more importantly, young drivers of all colors began to study his tactics as a reference. Because their glory has never been just about winning combats. It was about morality that resisted, the doctrine that survived, the logic that overcame arrogance. But the story was not yet over, because one last number, hidden for years, was about to be revealed, and he would forever rewrite the true impact of the Red Tails in the skies of Europe. When the engines finally fell silent and the skies of Europe emptied, the Reich left behind more than wreckage. He left an ideology broken by a force that he did not understand, and that he never respected. For the Luftwaffe, the real threat never came from the numbers alone, but from the cold logic behind them. The Tuskegee Airmen, a unit created as a segregated experiment, had won with method, discipline, and technology applied to the doctrine. The red tail, which began as a mark of exclusion, has become a symbol of operational excellence. In the end, the war that began with derision ended with 112 fighters shot down by a force that the Germans judged to be too inferior to be taken seriously. The collapse of the Nazi machine was not only due to artillery, but to the internal contradiction of believing that merit and competence had color. The superiority that Hitler promised to his generals was defeated by mechanics who worked under tents, by pilots who never left the bombers alone, and by an industry that produced in months what it would take Germany years. The lesson is definitive. Strategy without structure is an illusion. Logistics overcomes arrogance. Doctrine conquers ego. And modern warfare is not only fought in the skies but in hangars, factories, and the blackboards of academies. Therefore, the story of the Red Tails does not end in 1945. It reverberates in every black pilot who enters a modern fighter today with its tail painted red in his honor. It lives in every school named after Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., in every Air Force aircraft that bears the Ramatelli emblem, and in every air escort simulation that teaches the doctrine developed by someone who was once forbidden even to sit at the table. Roscoe Brown summed it up like few others. We won 3 wars. Against fascism, racism, and oblivion, and even enemy generals knew this. In the cold words of a German officer interrogated after the surrender, we lost to determined men, and for factories that don't sleep. If you believe that the story should be told with accuracy and respect, like the video, subscribe and activate the bell. This helps the channel to continue digging up forgotten truths and to give voice to those who the war tried to erase. And say in the comments, what was the most shocking data for you? The mission is now yours. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.